there you go, Dave Ramsey, and all of you who else are wondering about it. Take that for what it's worth, and it's worth gold because it comes from Lutheranism, which is the right way to be. So I've been getting quite a few questions from folks in my congregation and from people in general in the community about how do Christians relate to the civil authorities. So that's going to be our big focus for this video, is how Christians in the current situation with COVID-19 and the government's oversight, and now the government's locking down of things, and also the government trying to give handouts to people and the church now with the SBA loans. How do Christians relate to this? How do churches relate to this? Now, a big motivating factor for this video is Dave Ramsey's comments. I've had a lot of members of my congregation, we've had some organizational meetings, and people have been saying, Dave Ramsey said that Christians and churches shouldn't take this SBA money because it lets the government in the front door. I'm going to disagree with Dave Ramsey, just to put it out there up front. I don't think that that's a good take from Dave Ramsey. I'm going to give some reasons for that towards the end of this video, but I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson about why I'm taking this position in the current situation. And the history lesson begins with Martin Luther. So what a cliche for a Lutheran pastor to go right to Martin Luther. Now, we could take a look at some scriptural passages too. However, I'm going to put the scriptural passages aside. Not that they're not important, but I think Luther really distills this for us. We could look at Romans. There's several passages in Romans. We could look at 1 Peter. That's probably going to be the one that I draw on the most in my response to Dave Ramsey, 1 Peter chapters 2 and 3, where St. Peter lays out quite a clear teaching about how Christians are to relate to the civil authority. Now, but to start, I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson about Luther, because he really gives us a good example of how we relate to the civil authority. Now, in 1520, Luther is at the very beginning of his reformatory acts, right? 1517, he nails the 95 Theses, he's teaching, he's preaching. There's a lot of stuff going on in the German lands about how German nobility, princes and dukes and all these different noble people, how do they relate now to the Holy Roman Empire, right? So the Holy Roman Empire is in charge of the German lands, as a civil authority, but now all of these Lutherans now all these Lutheran princes have to figure out how they relate to the civil authority. So Luther writes this big letter to all the Christian nobility saying that the Christian church is still obligated to obey the civil authorities, right? That just because you're a Christian and because you're a German prince doesn't mean you get to disobey the overarching civil authority, that is the Holy Roman Empire. You don't get to disobey the Holy Roman Empire. Now, a year later, the emperor, Charles V, calls Luther in and brings him to Worms. And you have this whole scene where Charles, the emperor, is now telling Luther that he has to recant all of his teachings. And what does Luther do? Luther completely disobeys the emperor. He goes, it seems like he goes completely back on what he has just told all the Christian nobility that Christians are obliged to do dutifully to serve and obey the civil authority. And now he's standing in front of the highest power of the civil authority and he's saying, no, I'm not actually going to obey you. Now, why does he make this move? And for those of you who are Lutherans, probably this is coming pretty easy to you. I'm sure this isn't a mystery, but for some of you, this is all new. So Luther would go on a little bit later, I think a year or two later, and he writes this other huge piece on temporal authority, or on the civil authority, because he's responding to all these continuing issues. And in this third thing, I think this is a year or two later after he's in Worms, he writes this big thing to all the nobility and a lot of the church people about how the temporal authority needs to be obeyed, right? Or where and when the temporal authority needs to be obeyed. And he gives some very clear distinctions. Now, in this treatise, if I'm reminded right, or in this big piece of writing, there are 3 distinct sections, and I think we're only going to really focus on the first 2. Now, in the first one, I have to remember now, let me look at my notes really quick. All right. In the first piece of this writing, Luther points out how the civil authority is ordained to care for the things of the world, but that it is ultimately not essential for the church to function, right? The church functions through the preaching of the gospel, through the administration of the sacraments, through the calling of all to faith, And that can be done without any civil authority, right? The church can exist without the protections of the Constitution. The church can exist anywhere it wants. So far as there is a preacher preaching and administering the sacraments, there is where the church is, right? Wherever there is the word rightly distinguished, the word that kills and the word that makes alive, wherever the promises of God are given, and the signs and tokens of those promises, mainly baptism, the Lord's Supper, where those are distributed according to Christ's commands, that's where the church is. And that doesn't take a civil authority. That doesn't take the IRS. That doesn't take anything to constitute it, because the church is only constituted by Jesus and his commands, right? By Jesus and his word. So you have that, right? Luther makes a really clear distinction. There's a very large distinction, a very clear divide between the church and the civil authority. And the church doesn't need the civil authority to exist. The church exists before the civil authorities, because the church is rooted in God and his word. However, then Luther goes on to make another very important distinction, which is that the civil authority is still ordained by God. That God has given the civil authority into this world, and given the civil authority into the world for the protection of Christian people and for the establishment of good governance and citizenry throughout all nations, right? That the civil authority exists for the primary purpose of punishing wickedness, for hindering vice, for keeping corruption at bay, for promoting good, for executing justice, and all those sorts of things, right? That's why God has ordained the civil authority. So the civil authority does have benefits to the church, in that when the church exists in a peaceful, calm, quiet environment, that's nice, right? It's not bad, it's not good, it's nice, it's beneficial. We thank God that he gives us a good, stable government, because where the church exists in places where there aren't good, stable governments, that's chaotic, it's troublesome, it's hard for Christians, right? Now, this is, of course, where we're going to do a little bit of jumping off right into this issue with Dave Ramsey, and we're going to bring up a lot of the text of 1 Peter. Now, we're studying 1 Peter here at St. John Lutheran on Monday nights, if you want to be involved in that. And in 1 Peter, Peter is giving some very clear recommendations and teaching to the Christians in his time. Now, he says really, really clearly, honor the emperor. And at that time, the emperor is not a Christian. And St. Peter is also saying that the emperor is going to be a significant cause of suffering for you Christians, but that this isn't a bad thing. Now, does this immediately mean that we should be involved with everything that the state is doing? Now, I don't think so, right? We should definitely critique the state where the state needs to be critiqued. But this, of course, brings us back to this distinction. The church has authority over spiritual things, over eternal things. The state has authority over temporal things. The state does not have authority over the soul. The state does not have authority over the conscience. The state does not have authority over faith, right? That's the big distinction. The church does. The church dictates these things. The church teaches these things. The church promotes these things. The state does not. The state only exists to bear the sword, to punish and to execute righteousness, civil righteousness in particular. The church exists not to punish, not with the sword anyway. The church has its own set of disciplines instituted by God through Jesus, but that is not death, right? There's not death. There may be spiritual death that comes with the discipline of a church, but definitely not physical death, right? Now, I'm not going to go into all the stuff about that, but where we're going with this is the church exists for the proclamation of the gospel. Now, the church is made up of a bunch of citizens and a bunch of people, and has an institutional quality too, right? And as an institution, especially in America, with that institution comes certain obligations. Now, this is where I don't understand Dave Ramsey's thinking at all, right? If Dave Ramsey is saying that the church and the state should not have any interaction with each other in the Western world, and particularly in America, I can't understand this. The state has certain protections on the church, right? Right now, 501c3 status, right? That's I think a fairly excellent thing for the Christian church to have. And who does that come from? It comes from the state. The church didn't come up with this, right? The church wasn't demanding this sort of stuff. The state brought this about. The state issued this. It went through all the state mandates and it became a law, right? And So I don't understand what this is about. And if Dave Ramsey is recommending that the church or Christians not take handouts from the federal government, I haven't heard anything about backing out of Social Security, right? Dave Ramsey, does he have a big thing about Social Security and how Christians shouldn't be involved in Social Security or take welfare or anything like this? If he does, I haven't heard it, because I'm sure he wouldn't say that. Now, this, of course, brings up the confused nature of this whole thing. The state is going to interject or retract its attention from the church as an institution throughout generations, right? Throughout generations. The state is going to enforce its strictures on the church, and it's going to withdraw it. So right now, the state has come in and said, you guys can't meet in groups more than 10. Now, how do we respond to that as a church? This is not a matter of persecution, all right? This is not the state coming in and saying, oh, you Lutherans with your justification by faith, or you Catholics with your transubstantiation, oh, you guys got to cut this out. And if you don't cut it out, we're going to cancel all your church services. No, this is the state looking out for the quietness, stability, health, and well-being of the citizenry, which is exactly why they exist, right? And asking and now demanding that the church limit its attendance to 10 or less, right? And in some places, not have any attendance at all, right? For those of you that are in shelter-in-place orders, now you have no attendance. Now, is this a matter of persecution? The answer to this question is no, definitively not, because the state is not attacking the conscience or the soul, right? The state is not attacking the conscience or the soul. What is going on here is the state doing its job to make sure the citizenry of the land are taken care of, and we as Christians are duty-bound and obligated to obey that citizen or to obey that civil authority for the betterment of the citizenry. This brings us to the fifth commandment about watching over what's good for our neighbors' bodies. We're obliged to do this by the fifth commandment, by God himself, because he has issued the civil governments to watch over us as a people. Now, does this mean the church should not have SBA loans? Absolutely not. The church should take these SBA loans. Now the church should take the SBA loans. You can make up that decision as you want for you and a congregation. If it comes down to it, as a congregation, we'll probably take an SBA loan. Now, why are we going to do that? We're going to do that because, on the one hand, the civil authority is cutting off a significant means for the establishment of the institution that we have. Now, would this church survive if we didn't take an SBA loan out? Sure, it would. Would I survive as a pastor? Absolutely, I would. I would have a little less money in my pocket. We probably wouldn't have power in the building. We might have to move off the property. Whatever would be the case, we would do that. However, we don't want to do that. Now, is that a matter of our lack of faith? No, it is absolutely not a matter of our lack of faith. We're making sensible, reasonable decisions guided by the fact that we're not being persecuted here. And while the government is taking something away from us by what it is obligated to do because of its position, the civil authority is taking something away. On the other hand, the civil authority is holding out something to help sustain the church for this time. And it's offering fairly significant protections for the church with the usage of this money. Now, apparently Dave Ramsey's whole thing is, well, they're going to get in there and then they're going to make you do all this other stuff that they're just going to start cramming stuff down your throat. And that could happen. Now, if that happens, we have to revisit this whole video. But as far as I can tell, from everything that I've read coming from the federal government, coming from a lot of the institutions that are in the United States, that's not what's going to go on here. Even the federal government's going to offer forgiveness for these loans, which the church is eligible for. Now, that's a matter of prudence in our decision-making, wisdom, discernment, that when we take these loans, we shouldn't just take them willy-nilly. We should have a plan in place as Christians, especially as a church. We shouldn't go like hog wild nutso, taking out millions of dollars of these SBA loans, so that we can get some sort of interest-free thing. You can get yourself in trouble by taking out these SBA loans. You can definitely get yourself into some trouble. But be sensible, be prudent, be wise, discuss it with the congregation as a whole, especially if you have financial people who are attuned to these sorts of decisions and what needs to be made. But there is nothing, absolutely nothing, not in Scripture, not in the confessions, not in any sort of good theological thinking that I've come up with, which should absolutely forbid Christians from taking an SBA loan. This is in your private business, right? You shouldn't be afraid of taking this as a Christian if you own a private business that is suffering during this time. And this also applies to the church, which has a footprint in the civil authority. It has a footprint in the world. Now, if the church as a whole, if your congregation doesn't care to suffer and reduce its footprint in the civil authority, if you want to, you want your lights to shut off, you want to go to a house church or whatever you're going to do, that's your decision as a congregation. You are free to make that decision. We don't want to do that. And Dave Ramsey shouldn't be shoulding all over people, telling them what they should be doing. Now, I know I'm shoulding all over people, but it makes me really upset when a guy like Dave Ramsey, who has a really, really big mouthpiece for a lot of Christians in this nation, starts offering laws that should burden the Christian conscience. That just drives me up a wall. And it drives me up a wall because I'm a Lutheran, right? It drives me up a wall because I'm a Lutheran. Because you as a Christian are free to make this decision, and your congregations are free to make this decision without somebody offering some law from the outside. Now, it's terrible. It's terrible that Dave Ramsey did that. If this is exactly what he's done, I'm probably being unfair to Dave Ramsey because I don't know, but I've interacted with enough of his stuff to have a good idea. So, should Christians take an SBA loan? Yes, you should, if that's what you want to do. Should Christian congregations take out an SBA loan? Sure, absolutely. If that's what your congregation wants to do, you should do it. It shouldn't be done willy-nilly. You should have a plan in place for it. You should be prudent with it. You should be able to know that you're going to pay it back, know that how you're going to use it is within the parameters of its usage for its forgiveness, right, from the federal government. Because if it's forgiven, then the federal government doesn't have any power. Now, if you're taking out a giant loan and the tentacles of the federal government are in there for a long time, then you might have a problem. You should really think about that, but that goes back to the prudence involved in the decision-making process for you as a Christian or for Christian congregations as a whole. Now from here, you can spread this out into a whole lot of other things with regards to your Christian life in relation to the civil authority. Is the civil authority asking or demanding you to recant any significant aspect of your Christian faith by handing out to you an SBA loan? The answer to that question is no, they're not. Not at least as far as I found. Nothing that I've read is saying that you have to withdraw any aspect of your Christian confession or moral conviction that falls out of your Christian conviction, right? That's not happening. And because that's not happening, there isn't really an issue to be burdened in the conscience with this. If we're going to go down the road of the boogeyman, the federal government boogeyman, then we have to revisit a whole host of things as Christians, right? Like I've already said, our tax status, whether Christians should receive Social Security, right? Can Christians even be employed by the civil government and all this sort of stuff, right? What are we even talking about when it comes down to this? So for now, though, as long as I've talked for enough about this, for now, just know that your conscience shouldn't be burdened by taking an SBA loan out as a Christian congregation, because it's perfectly fine, it's perfectly reasonable for right now. Now, that's maybe a hedge, but if something does happen, right, if in November we have a new president and that president comes up with policies and offers other policies with regards to these SBA loans, if they're still outstanding, then we have to revisit that. But for right now, with regards to everything that's coming out from our federal government at the moment, this isn't a burden to Christian consciences. There you go, Dave Ramsey, and all of you who else are wondering about it. Take that for what it's worth, and it's worth gold because it comes from Lutheranism, which is the right way to be Christian.